And this is where I actually need this. So Mitch is going to talk about the role of paid and earned media in building entertainment brands, reminding, informing, and enhancing enjoyment. So Mitch does a lot of interesting work. Some of his work is actually on negative political advertising. So that's something he's been studying on why people turn negative in political ads. He got his PhD from Duke. And one of his favorite activities is daddying. He loves to be a dad. And he's a great dad. So.
Thanks, Amit. I'm going to talk to you about the role of paid, earned, and owned media. This is work that I have been doing with Rick Stalen as my co-author. And my name's Mitch Lovett, as Amit indicated. I'm at the Simon School of Business and University of Rochester. So what the starting point for this is that engagement and as a part of branding is a key piece today. And brands are taking risky bets. I'm not going to go through the kinds of risky bets that brands are taking. Maybe they're calculated risks in the perspective of brands that you know some of the trade-offs. And so what I'm going to try and do today is elucidate some aspects of these trade-offs to help in making those calculated risks. And in particular, the thing I'm really going after is sort of thinking about how effective are these engagement strategies. Okay, and so when I mean engagement, I'm going to take a slice of this. And that slice is going to be thinking about these three kinds of media, the three media. And just to make sure we're sort of on the same page in regards to the three media, I'm going to define them in my own words here. So I'm going to talk about paid media. And in the study that I'm going to be talking about, paid media will be TV ads. Okay, so it's going to be TV ads. But you can imagine this could include traditional print, TV, radio, whatever, as well as digital advertising. But in the study, it'll be just TV, or primarily TV. And then earned media is going to be your word of mouth and your social media, as well as media coverage. And in the context of the study that I'll be doing, actually most of the earned media is offline word of mouth. And this is actually true for word of mouth in general, that most word of mouth is offline. It's something like 85% of word of mouth is offline. We spend most of our time thinking about social because that's the thing that we can easily sort of put out there into the space. But actually most of the conversation is offline. And so that's going to actually be a key piece of how I'm measuring and thinking about earned media here. And then the last one is owned media, where it's your properties. You're not paying for exposures, but somehow you have access to people, like your website, people coming to your website, or some other property that you might be taking advantage of. So this paid, earned, and owned media is going to be the slice of engagement that I'm thinking about, where you can be engaging them by paying for it, by earning it, or through properties you own. And remember, I'm interested in how effective are these different strategies relative to each other. But one of the other things that I'm going to focus on is not just how effective they are, but the nature of influence these different media have on consumer behavior. And so I'm going to focus on three roles here. Those three roles are going to start with not a dating service, okay, but the idea of a match. The first role is going to be about the match between the consumer and your brand, and how good is that match. And what the role that the media might play is to inform people of how well it fits into their lives, the match between your brand and the consumer. And this is the informing role of advertising, or the informing role of earned media in this case. The second role is about reminding them, keeping it on the top of their mind, that your brand is right there when they're thinking about consuming or purchasing, the reminding role. And then the third role is about enhancing enjoyment. And this enhancing enjoyment is kind of a different perspective where you're thinking about this is like the salt you're adding. That you've got the meal, that's your brand, but you're trying to add something else to it. Okay, it's not the main consumption they're doing, but something else. And that they might anticipate those other things that they're going to be doing with your brand, and that would lead them to want to purchase your brand or consume your brand more frequently or earlier. So these are the three roles I'm going to be studying. reminding, informing, and enhancing enjoyment. For these roles, I want to dig a little deeper to give you a sense of the mechanism behind these roles and how it's influencing consumer behavior. Now, the fundamental idea here is that those mechanisms are going to drive the way you want to plan your media. Okay? And so that's why I'm going to be digging into these mechanisms. I'm going to start with the reminding role. So for the reminding role, you want to think about reminding as getting into the awareness, into the consideration of whether your brand is even in the game, so to speak. Okay? So it has to be in the memory, it has to be in the mind in order to be considered. Now, if you're one of two brands, this role may not be as influential. The study context for me is going to be entertainment brands where you have hundreds of options every half an hour. Okay? It's very important to be top of mind in that kind of setting. Okay? So I'm going to build a model. So I'm a quantitative modeler, which means I do lots of math, as Ahmed pointed out. So lots of math, and this model is going to be built on a psychological model, cognitive psychology model called ACT-R, and it's actually inspired by our next speaker, Navdeep Sani. So the model will incorporate a mathematical model of memory. Okay? And I'm not going to show you all the math, so don't worry about equations. But the key idea here is that memory diminishes. Okay? If you don't have cues for your memory, which in our case is going to be the media, exposures or encounters, or it's going to be some experience with the brand. If you don't have those things, the memory is going to diminish. But the cues could each increase our memory. Okay? An encounter with the brand could increase the memory, and those increases could have different magnitudes, different effects, depending on the kind of media. So it looks kind of like this. So you have time as the horizontal axis here, and memory activation level, which is directly related to whether they're going to be considering your brand, as the vertical axis. And you see here that that line starts up high, so they had some high memory for you at the beginning, and it's decreasing. Okay, so there weren't any cues. And then they get a paid exposure, say, and it hops up. That paid exposure increases the memory, and then it starts decreasing again. They watch the show, and it hops up again. And that increase is bigger than it was for the paid media. And then a little bit later, you have the earned media, and it hops up again. And that increase directly relates to whether they're considering your brand. Okay? So this is the idea here, where we're basically battling and keeping our brands in the top of mind of people. This probably resonates pretty well with what you're trying to do on a daily basis. Okay? So that's the memory role, the reminding role. The informing role is about the match between our brand and the consumer. Okay? How well does it match? And really, the informing role is getting people to learn about that match, getting them to recognize that there is a fit. Okay? Now, in this case, it's going to directly influence choice if they consider us. So if the consumer is considering your brand, if it's in the consideration at all, then you're thinking about match. Okay? But first you have to have that consideration. The model here is called a Bayesian learning model, which basically means it builds in aspects that we're pretty sure are involved in the nature of how people learn. What is involved in that? That as you get more information, each new piece of information is not as valuable, basically, to constructing your understanding of the match. Okay? If I already know a lot, one more piece of information is not going to shift my view of the match very much. And so that leads to this diminishing returns concept. So it looks kind of like this. Okay? You've got your influence on the vertical axis, and the number of encounters. Okay? This could be an experience, or it could be an exposure of paid exposure, earned exposure, whatever kind of exposure. And it's diminishing. Okay? So as you go down that curve, you're leading to less influence. So you really want to be up high on the curve when you're doing your advertising or when you're getting the earned media. Okay? So this is the informing role. The last role is the enhancing enjoyment role. And in this role, remember, we're trying to anticipate future encounters. That's the idea, that consumers are going to anticipate these future encounters that they might have with the brand. And that anticipating the future encounters means that they're going to incorporate that into their decision about whether to engage or not today, whether to consume your brand today. So am I going to have future experiences that are going to benefit me by consuming today? Now, each media could actually enhance enjoyment to different degrees. Okay? It could be that advertisements earned media, they could have different ways of influencing this enhancing enjoyment, different degrees to which they do it. So I'm going to illustrate the idea here with socializing. Okay, so earned media. So you could watch either live or in delay. Okay, now if you're watching live, then you're going to have more opportunities to have these encounters before the next episode of a show appears. Okay, to have more opportunities to talk about the recent things that are happening if you're watching live. And so if you're a light socializer, that means you might have these two smiley faces, two encounters you might have if you watch it live, whereas if you watch it delayed, you might just get one such encounter in the future. Whereas if you're a heavy socializer, you're going to be getting more. You're going to maybe have 4 such encounters in the live option. Okay, but if you wait a few days, you may only be getting, say, 2. And so by looking at heavy versus light socializers, we can figure out how much of an impact, actually, this enhancing enjoyment role will have on people. Okay, because the difference in how much earlier they want to watch, how more frequently they want to consume our brand, that's going to be what's driving these differences in behavior, this enhancing enjoyment idea. So that's the third role, the enhancing enjoyment. So we have these 3 roles, the informing, reminding, enhancing enjoyment roles. Okay? Now, I'm not telling you these 3 roles out of a scholarly discussion today. I'm telling you them because actually these roles shape how you want to plan your media, how brands should act. Okay? And so I want to give you an example, an illustration of what I mean by this by working with just paid media, maybe the most familiar one. Okay? So what does this look like? If advertising is entirely informative, that's the entire role that advertising is playing, then what are we after? Okay, what are we after in terms of our advertising? We want to advertise when people are uninformed. Remember that curve that's falling down? We want to be up at the top of that. That's where we're going to have the biggest impact. That's where we're going to get the biggest return on investment from our advertising. Okay, so when they're uninformed. But you could also have new cohorts of consumers arriving that we need to inform. So it's not necessarily just when the product launches. Okay, so we have to sort of keep track of where these uninformed consumers are and try and get the message to them. Okay, that's if it's informing. Okay, but now consider sort of the reverse. Let's say it's all about reminding. Okay, if it's all about reminding, then actually we're just trying to keep on top of the mind of the consumer. The sort of burst strategy idea around new consumer cohorts or new products is not necessarily as effective. We need to have ongoing support so we're constantly in the consideration. Okay? So it's very different. Now, we might still do some bursting to trigger trial. Okay? But we're thinking much more about ongoing support instead of more of a burst. Okay, so what are the research questions here? Thinking about these 3 media and these 3 roles, I'm just trying to answer the question, what goes in the box? How effective is each one of these media along the dimensions of each of these roles? Okay, so in addition to these 3 media, by necessity, I have to also look at the experiences themselves, because experiences with brands are, of course, going to generate memory. They're going to, of course, generate information about how much I like that brand. Okay, so in addition to these 3, I'll also be talking about experiences. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about how I go about doing this. This is the sort of framework that I'm using, and let me talk about how I'm going about doing this. So the context of this study is going to be a single TV show, new TV show, Human Target. And I know there's not a lot of participation happening in these talks mostly, but how many of you watched Human Target? That's exactly what I expected. Unfortunately, I wasn't very good at forecasting the demand for these shows. It was a coin toss between this and Modern Family, and I'm guessing if I asked how many of you watch Modern Family, there'd be a few more hands. So besides demonstrating that I don't have the ability to forecast shows ahead of time, the important part is actually that it appears that most shows look more like Human Target that are launched than Modern Family. Okay, most shows are not runaway successes. Okay, they're mostly more looking like the Human Target. But there's going to be some characteristics of that show that should, I want to put sort of boundaries on where you should apply the specific kind of learnings that I'm going to talk about in terms of the size and nature of the roles. Okay? So I worked with P&G Vocal Point panel for this. We collected about 1,720 people, monitored them over about 7 weeks. Okay, collected measures for before the show began, as well as weekly measures after the show was running. And those weekly measures included the obvious things you need to know, like viewing, and how many exposures they got to advertising, how many encounters with social media or talking with friends, all that kind of stuff. And again, one of the key pieces here is I wanted to make sure I got that offline word of mouth, not just online. We could monitor online word of mouth with some social media listening. The problem is we would get a tiny slice of the conversation. Okay, when I say tiny, less than 20%, 15% range of the conversation. And so it was important to use surveys here for that purpose. But there was a second reason that we wanted to use surveys here. We wanted to distinguish the informing role from the reminding role. And the problem is if you don't do this carefully, you're going to mix them up. Okay, and I went through and studied this with just mathematical models, and I quickly figured out you mix them up if you don't do this carefully. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm actually collecting the expectations people have about how much they're going to like the show. Okay, so the expectations they have about how much they're going to like the show, and those expectations are exactly that belief they have about how well this brand matches with them. And in this case, a TV brand, okay, TV show brand matches with them. Okay, so that allows me to distinguish that informing role from the reminding role. And so I need to use surveys to get those self-reported expectations as well as this offline word of mouth. Okay, so I use this survey here. So what do I do with those surveys? Well, first of all, I look at the data. Okay, so I try to understand what does the data look like. And in this context, I'm going to give you a little setting for the data. So the far left figure here is the viewing. The red line is the ratings from Nielsen at airing. Okay, and the black line in that figure is the viewing reported in the survey. Okay, and one of the things you can see is that it does look like we track pretty well here. You also see that there's a sharp decline in viewing after the first couple episodes. Okay, and it happens, most of that decline happens in like the first few episodes. And then it sort of stabilizes around 7 to 8 million viewers. Okay, so that's the first thing. So we have a sharp decline at the beginning. And this is going to be an important characteristic of the data to be able to pick up. Second thing is the media frequency. So you can see the black line here is the paid media. The blue line is the owned media, and the red line is the earned media. And the red and blue lines are not quite flat. The blue line's declining slightly, but the red line is basically flat. Okay? But the black line is declining sharply at the beginning and then flattens out. Okay, so you might also already sort of be forming a hypothesis that, oh, it's going to be about paid media. Like that seems to be correlated with the viewing. Okay? My model is not going to use that variation you're seeing right there to figure out whether it's about paid, earned, or owned, or the roles. Okay? It's all the individual level behaviors, and this is aggregate behaviors. Okay? But it already looks like maybe something's going on with the paid media here. The last graph here is the expected liking. It's the average across viewers for the black line and non-viewers for the red line. The fact that viewers are increasing and non-viewers are decreasing is reflective of people learning about the show. But you notice that red line is basically flat the first few episodes, exactly when we see the viewing dropping off pretty dramatically. This suggests the informing role is probably going to have a hard time picking up these aggregate trends. Okay, why? Because the expectations aren't going down when viewing is dropping. Okay? Yet there is learning going on. Okay, so the research approach. I take this data at the individual level and I apply what's called a structural model. Okay, what a structural model is basically I take all those roles, I write down mathematical equations to capture the nature of those roles. And then I estimate off the individual level data how consumers are making decisions. I use those estimates. Okay, it's kind of like, you can think about it like a regression. Probably most of you have done regressions on steroids. Okay, it's like regressions mixed with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay, that's what this technique is. Okay, very, very intensive calculations. And then I use those estimates to figure out what an increase in media encounters would do to individuals' behavior. Okay, and I'll actually not talk about it, but I also use it to look at an increase. If you could actually expand the size of the heavy socializer group, how would that influence things? So the conclusions from the study are that the model seems to capture behavior. Okay, we're capturing all three of these media at once, and we're capturing the roles. First thing is sort of straightforward and obvious. If it didn't happen, I'd be worried. The experiences are very informative, and they generate a lot of memory. Okay, so when you watch a show, you have a lot of memory, and it's very informative. And then here's the real heart of what we're interested in. Okay, what does that 3x3 look like? And what we find is that, number one, the paid media is the biggest effect. Okay, as I already alluded to, it's the biggest effect. Okay, but if you look at that column for reminding, it's really big. Okay, that's basically the main role that the media appears to be playing in this data. Okay, it's about reminding. There's almost no impact of the media on informing. People are not learning about the match through these advertisements. They're learning about the match through experiences. Okay? They're uncertain about the match, and then they're learning about them through experiences. The enhancing enjoyment role, there is a role of enhancing enjoyment with the earned media. Okay? But it's actually relatively small. It is not driving huge amounts of viewing. Now that could be a characteristic of this show. It was not a huge social show. Okay, so reminding is key, informing not so big for the media, and enhancing enjoyment, small role in this context for earned media. Okay, so implications, paid and earned media are serving to keep the show in memory, okay? And that's leading to trial, which then leads to learning about the match. Okay? Paid media is much more effective than earned media, over 4 times more effective than earned media. Now, this is not accounting for cost. I want to be very clear. This is not accounting for the cost that it takes to generate a paid exposure versus an earned exposure. And so it may be that cost effectiveness, they may be balanced out more. Okay? But this reminding role leading to the trial is a start, but we need that ongoing sort of reminding role to keep people engaged, okay? To keep people coming back. And so to take this back to how to think about it for your brand, you'll have the desire to have ongoing support for your brand. When you're thinking about designing the ads in this context, you'd probably be thinking about how can we make sure it's memorable, much more than how can we make sure they understand like how well it matches their tastes. Like that's not the key. It's more about memorable. And that's my implications. So I guess I have a little bit of time for questions. Oh, you have to tap the thing or something.
Could you give us a little insight into how the data reflected the variables, particularly word of mouth variable, in terms of how it's measured?
Yeah, so in the survey, we asked them for each half week. We asked them whether they talked to a friend or a family member or colleague, whether they saw anything online about the show. Okay, and so we coded those as indicators for whether or not they got such an encounter for that part of the week.
The second comment, it strikes me that you should have sort of 2-stage models where the word of mouth or the earned is the second stage, and the first stage would be the paid. Makes any sense?
So stage in what sense?
It seems to me that the word of mouth, if the show is successful and gets to a certain level as a result of a paid media, then the word of mouth kicks in, and that shows a second level of engagement where people are actually talking about it.
So what you see here is actually that the earned media level is basically fairly stable throughout the entire period. Okay, so it's not the case that like earned media is ramping up. The story that you were saying. Now, it may be that for other shows, that would be true. In this case, that wasn't what we saw.
Why would nothing have an apparent impact on informing?
So it's not that nothing had an impact. It's that the information is so small that it's like, don't count on getting any ROI out of your advertising from that information. Okay, what it's really, they are being informed by experiences. They're being informed a lot by experiences. You see the episode, you know, like basically how well it matches you. By the second episode, you're pretty darn confident.
But wouldn't you expect that media could have an impact on getting people to watch the episode in the first place, and isn't that part of the point?
So it does have an impact on getting people to watch in the first place, but it's through drawing their attention to it, rather than through them going, oh, this is a perfect show for me. Okay? They're still uncertain. Like they see the ad or they talk to somebody about it and they're like, oh, okay, it sounds like it might be. But more the function is, oh, I didn't even know that show was on. I wasn't aware of it. That's the big impact. There is an informing role. It's just tiny compared to these other roles.
Yeah, so is it the copy changes in paid media don't have an impact on your results? So different advertising copy. And is it just related to that? Is it the burst quality of paid media that drives this whole, why it's more effective?
I can't speak to whether the copy is the reason, because basically the copy in this case was very similar, like the nature of the promos were very similar across the part of the season that I tracked. So I can't really speak to that. Doing some other work that builds off of this, where there's variation across shows and across genres and so forth, and how they present their entertainment products. But here, I can't speak to that.
So is it the burst characteristics because you can buy paid media? So obviously in the event that you have a hit show and you have incredible viral and so on, but here you can buy a lot. That's really what drives it's an introductory show or introductory advertising, and you can buy a lot bursts, but you can't do that with earned and others.
No, so it's not just the ability to burst. Okay, that's not the primary thing. This is per encounter, per exposure. It appears to be larger. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, I have that.
My question is about, you said, I think word of mouth is just 15%. Was that?
No, online word of mouth is 15%. Offline is 85% of total word of mouth, total earned media. 85% is offline conversations.
Was that when you did the study, or is that today? Do you think that's moved?
So I have data across lots of categories, like 16 different categories, over 600 brands. The average is pretty close to that.
Thank you.